In this video, we're going to go through an installation and setup of a DBsign server on Windows. And here in this environment, we have Windows Server 2016, and we're going to be using SQL Server 2019. I've already got those installed, and I've got a database already set up and ready to go for DBsign. Set up and configured. I also have a few other little prerequisites on here. We're going to be running Tomcat 9 to deploy the DBsign server on this machine, and we're going to be using Java, the JDK 14, the Open JDK. And apart from that, I've gone ahead and downloaded the DBsign installation files that I needed. I've got some test certificates that we're going to be using, the product ISO from the download website, and then my license file that I got from DBsign support. And so we'll be walking through the steps to configure the database and the DBsign administration tools and get everything set up, and then we'll deploy in Tomcat and test our installation. The actual DBsign installation on Windows is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to mount the product ISO that I downloaded and run the setup.exe from inside of there. Now, it's not required that you run the setup wizard like we're doing here. You could just copy the files off of the installation media from this directory. If you watched the Linux installation video, that's what we did on Linux. And you can follow that same kind of procedure on Windows if you don't want to go through the process of using the installation wizard. Now, all this is going to basically do is copy some files and create some start menu shortcuts. So it's a pretty simple installation if you do use the wizard. But what I will say is that if you use the installer, if you come back later and need to update your installation or install a later version, you're going to need to completely uninstall the version you have installed currently before you run this installation utility again. Now, if you run the uninstaller and remove all of your current files, it's not going to go out and do anything to your database. It's not going to mess with your server deployment on your application server. It's only going to remove the files in the start menu shortcut. So you're going to be good either way. So we're just going to make things easy for us right now, and we're going to run the installer. I'm going to click Install DBsign for HTML applications. And we're just going to run through the wizard here, accept the license agreement. I'm going to do a complete installation. That's going to give us all the files we need. Quick, and it's done. And close. And that will have installed under Program Files, x86, Gradkill Systems Inc., DBsign, Data Security Suite. And there's all of our files. And if we go look on our start menu here, we should see links to documentation and the configuration editor and the admin tools. And we'll be using those tools in the next parts of this video. In this section, we're going to look at configuring the DBsign admin tools and creating our initial database tables. But what I wanted to do first is just kind of step back and take a look at a few of the things that we've done to get the environment ready to do this. As I mentioned earlier, we're running on SQL Server 2019 here on Windows, and I have already created a database called DBsign. And you can see that there's no tables here right now. There is a user called DBsign that is the database owner. And I have also created a DBsign schema. And all of these are called DBsign. And those names they don't have to be called DBsign. They could be called something else. But I did want to be able to know where my DBsign tables were, and this was just an easy way to do it. Just follow your database naming conventions and user naming conventions for your environment. I have also gone ahead and installed and imported some certificates that I'm going to be using into my Windows stores. So this is my personal certificates here on this Windows machine. And I have some of our test certificates already installed in here. You'll notice the icon beside them has the key. That means that I also have the private key that goes along with these. These were imported from a PFX file that I have. I have also trusted the DBsign test root here in my trusted certificate authorities. And then under the intermediate authorities, I have test CA1. Now, just because these say DBsign, don't get confused. These specific certificates are not required for DBsign to work. These are just the test certificates that I have from my internal PKI. In your environment, you're going to have your own certificates. You're going to have your own PKI. It may be an enterprise PKI, or it may be like the Department of Defense PKI from DISA, or it could be a public commercial PKI like VeriSign or something like that, and you have all of your certificates issued from there. So don't get hung up on the fact that these actually say DBsign on them. Again, those are just names. They come from our internal test PKI. And so what we want to do is go ahead and start the DBsign admin tools. And we installed from the installer, so they're going to be here on the start menu. And we'll go ahead and open those up. And the first thing we're going to do is configure everything properly. And to do that, we just need to open up any one of the tools so that we can open the configuration tools. But I do know that after we configure, the first thing we want to do is do our initial table creation. So I'm going to go ahead and open the initial table creation tool, and it's going to prompt me to log in. And you'll see a lot of example stuff here, and this is just a default example config file that we're going to have to tweak for our environment. So I'm going to click the ... button right here. And this brings up the configuration editor. And we see a lot of stuff in here that says example, and we're going to get rid of most of this stuff. We have example database configurations, example cryptographic modules, example database certificate and CRL caches, and then example instances. And what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of all of these that don't have to do with our database that we're going to be working with, which is SQL Server, and then our crypto mechanism. And in this case, we're going to be using OS. We're going to be using the Windows cryptographic libraries and the Windows certificate stores for this DBsign installation. So I'm going to start down here in instances, and I'm going to get rid of everything except for default. Now, these instances allow you to do things like support multiple database connections, support different environments like dev, test, and production, or support different applications. For example, in your production environment, you may have a single DBsign server that's supporting application A, B, and C, and each one of those would have its own instance. Or on a developer's machine or a system administrator's machine, you may have multiple instances. You may have one for your dev environment, one for your test environment, one for production, so that you can centrally administer all that. So there's flexibility here with these instances, but for now, we only need one, and we're going to use the default instance. And so let's keep going up and deleting anything that doesn't have to do with SQL Server. Oh, now, it told me that when I was deleting MySQL that it could not be deleted because it's being used by the default instance. And if I try to delete anything up here that's referenced in another section, it's going to tell me I can't do it until I go and change that other section. So that one said default. So let's go and take a look over here. We see that this default instance is pointing to the MySQL configuration. So let's change all that to the SQL Server. We see another one here and another one here. And while we're in here, we'll see our cryptographic configurations for signing and for verifying. We're going to use the operating system key stores and underlying operating system modules for our signing and verifying operations. So we'll go ahead and change that to OS. Now we should be able to go back up here now and start deleting everything except for SQL Server. And we'll keep going. We'll do the same thing here under crypto because all we're going to be using is OS. Now this configuration file is much cleaner. It's much easier to look at, but I still don't like these names, example SQL Server. So let's go through, let's rename this for our dev environment. Let's say this is our development computer, and these names are just descriptive, so they just something that makes sense in your environment. So I'm going to say SQL Server _ dev. I'm going to do the same thing here for this one. SQL Server _ dev. Oop, I misspelled it. SQL Server _ dev. Rename. And what we'll notice as we went and renamed all of these, the things that referenced them, their names were also updated. So you don't have to go back and change any of that. So now we need to go and make sure that our cryptographic configuration, our crypto module, and our database is set up properly. So let's look at this crypto module first. And the only thing to configure here is the JCE library. And right now you'll see that it just says DCA JCE. And this works if the location of all the DBsign DLLs are in your path. They don't happen to be in my path here, so I'm going to have to explicitly define where the DLL is. So it's going to be installed in here with DBsign under Lib and Windows, and we're running a 64-bit Java here, so we're going in 64, and we'll choose DCA JCE.dll. Now, on recent versions of DBsign, you'll also see DCA JCE _ CAPI. This is the legacy DLL that is built on top of the Microsoft Cryptographic API, which is not the preferred way to do things anymore. This one is the new version that's written on top of the Microsoft Next Generation Crypto API. So unless you're running on a really older version of Windows and you explicitly need to use CAPI, choose DCA-JCE.dll. And then let's go look at our database configuration up here. And there's lots of things to configure up here, but specifically all we really want to do is change our host name. I'm running on localhost here. Your host name may be different. And my database name is DBsign. Again, for your database, you can call it DBsign. It can be in a different database. Just follow your conventions. My username is DBsign, and I'm using SQL authentication on this particular instance of SQL Server. So I will put in my password here. It is possible to use Windows authentication with the DBsign software. I'm not going to do that here in this example, but you'll just have to make sure that your JDBC driver supports that and that it's configured properly. We have customers that are doing that. The schema is DBsign, and the only other thing I'm going to change here is the driver jar path. What you'll see here is a relative location, and if these admin tools were run and the current working directory is the admin tools installation directory, you can specify a relative path here, and that's fine. But sometimes I'm not running from inside that directory, so I'm going to go and I'm just going to figure out exactly where that directory is, and it's going to be under admin tools and JDBC. SQL Server. Now you'll see two different things here, JTDS and Microsoft. We ship with the open source JTDS drivers. The Microsoft drivers work just fine. However, because of licensing considerations, we're not able to ship that. So if you want to use the Microsoft JDBC driver, it works just fine. You'll have to go download it from Microsoft and set it up here in your configuration. But for now, we're going to be using the JTDS driver. If you use the Microsoft driver, this class name is going to be different, and this connect URL is going to be a little bit different. So check out the documentation from Microsoft on that to make sure that everything is set up properly. So we've got our database set up. We've got our OS crypto library set up, and we've got our default instance all pointing to the right, cryptographic modules and databases. So we're pretty much good on this configuration. So let's close. It's going to ask us to save, and we'll say yes. And now we'll see we just have default here, and we'll click OK. And it should log us into the database, and it's going to load that cryptographic library. So if you don't get any error codes, you know you've got things set up pretty well. And so now we're at the initial table creation tool. We're running on SQL Server here, but we have DBsign customers that are running on all different database platforms, from different versions of Oracle to MySQL and Postgres and DB2, different versions of SQL servers. And if you're familiar with databases, you know that these different databases sometimes have different data types. They have different ways of storing data. So when we create our tables, we need to tell our admin tools what database we're on and give it a little bit of information so that it can use the right data types and things like that. So what we supply for you is a few files that have metadata concerning different types of databases. If you go and look in the DBsign admin tools installation directory, which is in this path here, and under config, and you'll see a handful of them in here, we're going to choose the one that's for SQL Server 2005 and greater. And we'll hit populate. And assuming that there's no errors, we're going to go through and it's creating all of our tables for us. And we'll let that finish. Operation complete. So we'll close that tool right there. And let's go back into our database tools here and refresh our tables underneath here. And there we go. We see all of our DBsign tables in the DBsign schema, also prefixed with _DBS. So we've got our database set up, we've got our admin tools configured, and we're ready to continue in the process. So what we'll do next is configure our trusted certificates and make sure we have all of our intermediate certificates that we need all in the proper places. So now we need to go ahead and set up DBsign's trust relationships with your PKIs or any certificate authorities whose users you want to trust. If you remember when we looked at the certificates that I installed into Windows earlier, just kind of getting an overview, we saw them broken up into a couple of different sections. We saw personal certificates, and we saw trusted root authorities, and we saw intermediate certification authorities. And this typically is how PKIs are set up, where you have a root certificate who issues these intermediate certificates, and the root certificate is the ultimate trust authority. That is the authority that you trust the most. And these intermediate authorities are segmented to handle maybe different functions or different departments in your organization. For example, you may have an intermediate authority for your HR department, and another for your development department, and another for your accounting department, or they may be segmented out into different categories based on function. Like in the Department of Defense, you have email CAs that issue the certificates that you're supposed to use for encrypting and signing emails, and then you have your identity CAs that issue your identity and authentication certificate. So it's just set up in different kinds of ways. So the PKI that we're using is our internal DBsign PKI. And remember that we saw that there was a root certificate and an intermediate certificate authority, and then we had our end user certificates. So we want to be able to sign with these end user certificates. So we need to be able to build a trust chain from one of these all the way up through the intermediates, no matter how many levels there are, all the way up to one of these roots. So we need to do a couple of things. We need to set up an explicit trust relationship with the root authorities that we want to trust. And then, just like here in Windows, we need to make the intermediate authorities available to us so that we have them when we're building certificate paths. So for example, when DBsign sees that I'm going to sign with test 1, it needs to build a path to one of our trusted certificates, which is going to be DBsign root CA. So it's going to have to go find somewhere this test CA1. Now, DBsign does not rely on these Windows certificate stores or any other source for its certificates other than its own internal trust setup. So just because they're installed here on Windows does not mean that DBsign is going to trust them. So we need to do that through our admin tools. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get our intermediates all into our database so that if we need them in the future to build these paths, they'll be there. So the first tool we want to open is the Certificate and CRL browser. And then we're going to choose the database connection that we've already got. And we have two tabs here. And so under the Certificates tab, we're going to add. And I have these certificates already downloaded on my machine. And I'm going to go find all of my intermediates. Now, I only have one, and I just stuck it in the database. If you're, for example, if you're using the DoD PKI, you're going to have maybe dozens of these to stick in here. And when you do add, you can select multiple certificates and add them all in one operation. But we only have the one, so we're done with that. We've added our intermediates. Now we want to go into the Trusted Certificates Manager. And this is the list of trusted root CAs. So we're going to go and we're going to add our root that we trust. Again, we only have one. If you're using the DoD PKI, you're going to have right now root CA2, root CA3, 4, and there is a fifth one. But we only have the one. In your environment, if you're not on the DoD PKI, you may just have one. You may have multiples. Now, this list, when we go to save it, it's going to tell us that it needs to be signed. And the reason we signed this trusted certificate list is because this is a special list. This is explicit trust, and we don't want other people going and modifying this list without our knowledge. So the only way to modify this list and to add or remove trusted certificates is to do it here through the admin tools. If you go into your database and start messing around with this list, your DBsign server is going to detect that the list has changed because it is digitally signed, and it's not going to let you do anything. Now, if somebody gets into your admin tools and they go and add or remove things and then they sign it, your list is going to change, but because it's digitally signed, you're also going to know who changed it, what certificate they used, and when they changed it. So we're going to go ahead and tell it yes. Now, I've got multiple certificates imported into Windows, as we saw. Now, here, we're actually using, to access these certificates for signing, we are actually using the OS key stores. And we're actually signing it with the operating system's cryptographic mechanisms. But we're not relying on the operating system's trust relationships. So we've got our trusted certs imported and signed. We've got all the intermediates that we need imported into the database cache. So now we're got our trust relationship set up, and we're ready to continue with the rest of our setup. Now that we've got our trusted certificates set up, what we need to go and do now is digitally sign the DBsign system templates. Now, if you're not familiar with DBsign and how it works and what templates are, that probably sounded like a bunch of nonsense. And we're not going to get into templates in detail right now. We'll do that in a later video. But basically, all you need to understand is that templates are a way that DBsign defines how data in your database is signed, what tables and what columns in those tables are included in digital signatures. And DBsign stores a lot of its configuration in the database, and so that data is protected with digital signatures as well, so that the configurations can't change without it being detected. And so there are several different templates already defined by DBsign, and they're all underscore prefixed with DBS underscore. And so we need to go ahead and sign all of those. And so we have an icon over here on the far right side that says sign all templates. And so we're going to go ahead and go do that. And it's going to run through all of them and sign them. And that step is done. Now, the last thing we need to do here in the admin tools is configure the server-side user that will be generating signatures on the server and telling it what certificate to use when it generates and signs data. And so we're going to do that, and we will do that in the user manager. If we hit this query button when it opens, we'll see that there are no users currently defined. And so we're going to need to add one. And most of this stuff is descriptive, but some of it matters what you put in here. The first name is descriptive. I'm just going to put DBsign and Notary for the first and the last name. And the username is special here. I'm going to put Notary. Now, this username has to match a specific username that's in your DBsign configuration file, and by default, it's called Notary. That's why I chose Notary here. And it is active. So we'll click Next. And now we need to tell it what certificate the Notary user is going to be using to sign on the server. So let's click New. And I have a certificate here for my test Notary user. And if you'll see, we're using the .cer file here and not the P12, because we're just defining the certificate that's going to be used, and we don't have to supply the keys right now. I'll show you what to do with your Notary P12 certificate here in just a minute. Security level, don't worry about what that means, just set it to 10. Is Notary? Yes, this is a special flag that says this user is a Notary certificate. And then the description, again, is purely a descriptive field here, so whatever you want to put in here. DBsign Notary Cert. And all of the information comes up here, and I'll click Finished. And now, with this entry up here highlighted, I'm going to go down and hit the Sign button. Are you sure you want to sign the selected items? Yes. And again, this item is digitally signed to protect it from modification, from unwanted modification. And we should be done here in the admin tools, so we can go ahead and close those up. And then we will start looking at deploying the server in Tomcat. Now that we've got everything set up DBsign-wise on the database, we can go ahead and deploy the server side in Tomcat. Now, on the Linux installation video, if you watch that, we deployed the WAR file by just simply dropping it in the Tomcat Web Apps directory, and Tomcat automatically extracted it and deployed it. What we're going to be doing here is just a little different, to show you a different way, is deploying through Tomcat's web interface, web administration interface. Again, if you're not using Tomcat, if you're using something else like WebLogic or JBoss or whatever it is that you're using, take a look at your documentation on how to deploy a WAR file. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about how Tomcat is set up here. I've got it set up as a Windows service that starts automatically when the thing boots, when the computer boots. And I also have it not running as the local system account, but I've created a Windows user and I'm running it as this user. Now, there's a couple of different reasons I'm doing that. One, I'm doing it from a security standpoint, and I can lock down this Tomcat user and only give it very limited permissions on this box. And so basically all it's going to be able to do is run Tomcat and your DBsign server, and it's not going to be able to touch or do anything else on your machine. So that's one reason. But a second reason is, as we talked about previously, the DBsign installation on this machine is going to be using the Windows key stores to access its private keys. And to be able to do that and do that as a service, you're going to need to create a special account for your service, just a standard user account, so that you can import certificates into that account's certificate stores. So we need to do that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to open up the command line here, the command prompt, and we're going to run as the Tomcat user. We're going to run a management console so that we can import the right certificates. And this is the password, Windows password for that Tomcat user. Whoop, I typed it in wrong. Tomcat. And let's take a look at our certificates. So we're going to add a snap-in and certificates for the current user. And okay. So if we go in here, we don't see anything under personal. So I'm going to import all task, import, and I'm going to import my notary signing certificate here into this Tomcat user. And I have put these just on the C drive. Choose PFX and P12s, and this is test notary. And this is the password for the P12. And now it is in the Tomcat's personal store. These got in there. I don't really need those in there. Those are my CAs, so I can remove them. I can leave them there. It really wouldn't have made much of a difference, but just for simplicity. But we'll see that because these things were all in the system stores, that we also have the root and intermediates in my in the right places in the Windows stores as well. So we've got the Tomcat user set up with its certificate now, and we can go ahead and start to deploy the DBsign server. Now Tomcat is installed here and running on localhost on port 8080. And I'm going to go in here into the app manager. There's a button right here. And during the installation process for Tomcat, I set up a username and an administrative username and password. And I have a list of the applications that are here, and these are just default from the installation. I'm going to go down here to deploy a WAR file, and it's on this machine here. So I'm going to click Browse, and I'm going to go to where DBsign is installed. And by default, that's in Programs, Files, x86, GradKill Systems, DBsign Data Security Suite, and the WAR file is down under HTML Server. And there it is, dbsign.war. And let's just deploy that. And Tomcat will do its things. And now we'll see it under the application list here. And if we click on it, we'll see the DBsign landing page. And if we go to the entry point, the server entry point page, we'll see that it's complaining because the license file does not exist. And so let's go set the license file up and make sure that it has all of its configuration files in place. So let's browse to that deployment directory. That's going to be in Tomcat, which is wherever Tomcat is installed. This is the default location with running the installer. And we're going to go into the web apps directory, and we're going to see DBsign. There's a lot of stuff under here. What we're interested in is the web inf directory. So let's keep that open, and then let's open another one where we're going to go and drag some files from. Now, I got my license file from DBsign support, so I'm going to copy it, and paste it right in here into the WebInf folder. Now, when you get your license file, it will probably not be named license.lic. It will probably have your license code, just a short alphanumeric code, .lic. But it's very important that when you copy it into WebInf that you name it license.lic, because that is specifically what the DBsign server looks for. It looks for license.lic in this WebInf folder. So that name and this location is very specific. Now, there's also a config file here, and that config file is another one of those stock example files. So we're going to take the config file that we used when we set up everything with the admin tools, and let me show you where that was created. So if we'll go back to the root of our C drive and go under users, it was created down in the user's profile. I happened to be logged in as administrator when I was doing the admin tools. So I'm going to go into there, but you're going to go into whatever user you were logged in as. And it's under app data. Now, app data is a hidden folder. You may not see it if your views are not set up properly, but just go up here to view and tell it to show hidden folders if you don't see app data. We're going into local low, GradKill systems, DBsign data security suite, and admin tools. And we're just going to copy that file and replace the one that's there in the WebInf directory. Now, we do need to make a couple of tweaks to that, and I'll show you how to do that. So we opened the admin tools from the start menu a little bit ago. Now we're going to open up the configuration editor. And when this pops up, it will look familiar to you. It's just a standalone version of the config editor that we used in the admin tools. So let's go to File and Open, and let's browse to that to the server's configuration file again that we just copied down under Tomcat's installation directory. Web Apps, DBsign, WebInf, dbsign.cfg. Now, you'll notice this is the same configuration that we were playing with earlier. But what we want to do here on the server is, by default, the DBsign server will reject any request that comes to it. So we want to enable a couple of different requests that we can do for testing. And there are different kinds of requests. There are requests that are global. They apply to everything on your DBsign server. And then there are kinds of requests that can be changed and configured on a per instance basis. So first, let's go up here to global settings, and let's take a look at a couple of these settings under request security for global requests. These are the request types down here, and you'll see get version, show stats, reset, perfmon, and GC, and most of these we're not even going to worry about. Right now, we're going to look at show stats. And the show stats request will display a lot of information about your server. It'll display the information about what versions of products are installed from DBsign to your operating system in Java. It'll also have request metrics and server metrics, and it's good for analyzing performance and for troubleshooting different things. But because it shows so much information, we don't want that just available to the public. And so right here beside show stats, we'll see they're all disabled to start with. And if we drop this down, we have a couple of other options. We have public and we have privileged. Now, public just means that it doesn't matter where this request came from, it's going to allow it to be processed. So on show stats, we're going to set this to privileged. And we see another configuration item up here, allow privileged from, and any request marked as privileged will only be allowed if they come from the IP addresses listed here. Right now, we only have the localhost loopback defined. Now, this is a comma separated list, supports IPv4 and v6 if you need v6 addresses. Right now for these, our privileged, we're going to only allow from localhost. If you needed to add another, you could put a comma and something like 192.168.1.2, and that would allow requests from that specific IP. Now, if you needed to open up to a specific section of your network, we can do wildcards. So we could do .star here, and that would open it up to everything on this subnet. We could even do something like this and open it up even further to anything on this one. So whatever you want to lock this down as much as you can, but you have some flexibility here as far as how to allow different hosts. But again, right now, we're leaving this at localhost. So now let's go down here to the instance. And if we scroll down, we also have request security here. And we have all kinds of different requests. The only request we're going to be using right now to test with is going to be app server sign. And again, I want to just set it to privileged. And I'll set my privilege address here just to localhost again. This request is just going to allow us to send a request to the server and tell it to sign some data and give us back the signature. And we're just going to set this to privileged again so that it can only come from localhost. So we'll close and save, and let's restart the Tomcat service. You can do it from here. Let's do it a more standard way. Let's open up the Windows services and restart the Tomcat service. And we should see when we refresh this page at DBsign/server, we should now see our license information, because it could go and parse the license file. And then in the next section, I'll show you how to test your installation real quick to make sure that everything is working properly. Now that we've got the DBsign server deployed and set up and configured, let's throw a couple of requests at it just to make sure that things are working properly. And remember that we enabled a couple of requests. We enabled show stats and app server sign. So first, let's do an app server sign. And so I'm just going to give a few parameters here and just do a simple GET request. The first one is content underscore type. And that's going to equal the type of request that we want to do. So app server sign. And then I just need to do a couple of things to tell it what to do during this app server sign request. And for this request, the only thing that we need explicitly is dbs underscore dtbs. And that stands for data to be signed. And we're just going to give it a string. Hello. So it's going to sign that string. Now there's another parameter that goes along with this one. dbs underscore dtbs fmt. So that's the format of the data to be signed. And in this case, it's text. Now we could have left this off because the default is text. So let's just do that and see what happens. And so that request is going off to the server. And the first request usually takes a little bit of time because it's got to do some initialization. I will refresh and you'll see that the request comes back much quicker. So what happened when I do this request is the server gets the data and it signs it. Now I can already see that this is successful and things are working. What comes back from the server is a URL encoded string. One of the things to look for is the error value and the error message here, and we see an error value of 0 and a message of success. So we know this came back successful. We also see, if we look, DBS signature, and then after it we see just a lot of junk. And all of that junk is the base 64 encoded PKCS7 CMS signature. So that's the kind of information you get back. We could add different flags in here to return back information about the signer, the certificates that were used to sign and things like that. But this is just for a test. We see that everything's working properly. We can keep refreshing and we see the value of the signature changing as timestamp changes and things like that. So it's working, it's signing data, it's connecting to the database, all of that stuff is working right. So let's take a look at show stats that I told you about earlier that we also enabled. So when we go here, we see a lot of different information. The first thing you see at the top is information about the types of requests that have come through. Like we just made 10 app server sign requests, and the last time was 46 milliseconds. And the average time on these was, right now, just over 10 of them, was about a half a second. This 46 milliseconds is typical. The only reason this average right here is higher at the moment is because we've done very few requests, and the first one took 5 seconds as the server was initializing. But other types of requests will show up here. If we had any requests that failed, they would show up under this section. Then we have other things like the health of our database connection pools, and how many times we've accessed them and how many connections exist in the pool. We've got information about our memory caches, how many certificates have been added and pruned and exist in the caches, the memory cache and the CRL cache. Certificate status caches, that's something else that's not enabled. We'll talk about that at a different time. These database cache statistics, we've got information about the version of our DBsign server here, how long it's been up, total requests. We've got information about the requests in process and how many RPMs, requests per minute, so different types of things. Server information, just stuff here about your server. We're running Oracle, we're running Java 14, OpenJDK, and what version of Tomcat, a lot of different stuff, memory usage, CPU usage, and then timing statistics from your DBsign server. So a lot of information there, but we've got everything configured, it's all working, and we've got it tested properly. I hope this helps you. We're going to be having lots more videos. Also go check out the others that we already have, and we will see you again.